It's been my pleasure to know Radi Roldan-Figueroa for, I think, about 15 years, maybe longer. We've known each other, and I've enjoyed his company and learned so much from him. He is a brilliant scholar, a thoughtful and caring teacher, and an analyst of the past who regularly challenges the boundaries of what the Academy thinks of as the Reformation. He's one of the few scholars I know who has the mastery of the traditional sources and concepts of early modern studies, while pairing that knowledge with an interest in questions and realms to which the Academy has not always paid attention. He and I will be at a Learned Society meeting next month with about 700 scholars from around the world. I'm certain that I can count on the fingers of one hand among that number those professors who could give an address on the Counter-Reformation, Latin America, and a vision of Luther as a religious cabildo. This expansion of our field of vision benefits the Academy, benefits the Church, benefits our efforts at recognizing our common humanity. I'm thrilled that he's joining us tonight, so on to the formal introduction. Radi Roldan-Figueroa is an associate professor of historical theology at Boston University School of Theology. Educated at the University of Puerto Rico, New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and Boston University, he wrote his dissertation under Carter Lindbergh on the biblical exegesis of Cassiodoro de Reina, concentrating especially on his 1569 translation of the Bible into Spanish. Prior to returning to teach at his alma mater, Radi held appointments at Claflin University in South Carolina, George W. Truett Theological Seminary, and Baylor University, both in Texas. He is the author of The Ascetic Spirituality of Juan de Avila, 1499-1569, published with Brill. With Doug Weaver and Brandon Frick, he has edited Exploring Christian Heritage, a Reader in History and Theology, published with Baylor University Press, and with William Pitts, he edited the collected works of Hansard Knollys, the first volume of which came out with Macon University Press this year. On top of those, he regularly publishes in the most prestigious journals in the field, with publications in the Archive for Reformation History, the 16th Century Journal, the Journal of Early Modern Christianity, and the Dutch Review of Church History. He continues to expand the boundaries of our knowledge of the past and what counts as Reformation studies in his next book, Literary Representations of Christian Martyrdom in Tokugawa, Japan. Spanish works produced in Spain, Mexico, and the Philippines circa 1598 to 1900 that he will bring out with Brill, we hope, very soon. His lecture tonight is entitled Martin Luther in Latin America, From the Counter-Reformation Myth of Latin American Catholicism to Luther as Religious Cabildo. Welcome, Professor.
Well, thank you very much. I want to say three things first. First one is thank you very much for this honor. It's a real privilege to be here with you tonight. I'm very grateful. Second, I want to recognize Professor Warholder. Professor Warholder has been my mentor for probably 15, 16 years, writing letters of recommendation for me, giving me opportunities to publish with him, as well as opening new ways for me, the guild that we share, the 16th Century Studies Conference. So thank you very much, Professor Warholder, a great mentor and personal friend. Thank you. The last one has to do with the method. I want to really mention this first. So the paper that I'm going to be reading is part of a larger work. And as a matter of fact, a form of this paper will be appearing this year in English, German, and Italian. And it's part of a larger work, and there are some important methodological questions. One of them is that, as you will see, based on the sources that I'm using for this, you will see a long list of men authors, of thinkers. And one of the challenges that I see here and that I'm working with now so that I can improve this methodologically is to ask about women writers or women thinkers in Latin America who were engaging the figure of Martin Luther. So I want to say that first because at a certain level I feel very embarrassed by the long list of male figures that I have here. But I want you to know that I'm aware of it and that it's a challenge. So for instance, I'm thinking now of moving into the 19th century and looking at the women scholars, women writers in places like Mexico, Peru, Puerto Rico, who somehow engage the figure of Martin Luther in their thinking. So I just wanted to share that with you, and I will just read my paper and share it with you. Those who have researched the history of Protestantism in colonial Latin America have done so by looking at the records of the Inquisition in New Spain and Peru. The consensus among scholars is that a robust Protestant presence in Latin America can only be detected in the 19th century. Here I follow a different strategy. First, by looking at colonial writers, I examine the ways that the image of Luther and the Luther affair was used to make sense of the colonial enterprise. I will discuss how figures such as Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés, Bartolomé de las Casas, and Jerónimo de Mendieta construe the figure of Luther in narratives that sought to explain the conquest and colonization of the New World. As it will be seen, all three perceive the Luther affair as an event that disrupted the civilizing and Christianizing effort that was underway. One of my main assertions is that Mendieta, in particular, contributed the core elements of a theopolitical myth that explained the place of the Spanish possessions within a counter-Reformation narrative centered in Europe. Then, in the second part of the presentation, I also explain how Luther was represented by different 19th century authors as evangelist, a pedagogue, and lukewarm revolutionary. The Luther affair and the counter-Reformation myth of Latin American Catholicism. Perhaps it will be an overstatement to suggest that the image of Luther figured prominently in the way that both Peninsulares and Criollos understood the Christendom character of the Spanish overseas empire. However, the Luther affair was an important point of reference in the mind of some of those who were interested in making theological and historical sense of the conquest and colonization of the lands and people on the other side of the Atlantic. A common perception was the characterization of Luther as the German heresiarch, even in the absence of a clear understanding of what Luther was about. Equally prevalent was the assumption that the Luther affair was an unfortunate distraction that sidetracked Charles V and prevented him from giving proper attention to the affairs of his American possessions. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés devoted nearly 35 years of his life to his Historia General de las Indias, or General History of the Indies, which he wrote between 1514 and 1549. The years of work behind this voluminous chronicle of the Spanish conquest of the Americas overlapped the rise and spread of Protestantism in Germany and other parts of Europe. Interestingly, he did not delve in any considerable measure on Luther or the significance of the movement he spearheaded. He, however, did articulate and recorded for posterity an opinion that was common at the time. Namely, Charles V was too busy and bogged down with the affairs of the empire to give any significant attention to the Americas. Fernández de Oviedo published Historia General de las Indias in 1535. A third part, consisting of 12 books, remained unpublished until the edition that José Amador de los Ríos issued between 1851 and 1855. Among the events that Fernández de Oviedo's chronicled in the third part of the Historia General were the civil wars of Peru, which lasted from 1537 to 1554. The Civil Wars were a series of armed conflicts between Spanish conquistadors involving control over the recently conquered city of Cusco. The factions at the time comprised the Pizarristas, followers of Francisco Pizarro and his brothers, and the Almagrists, or Almagristas. The latter were the supporters of Diego de Almagro, Pizarro's old friend and fellow captain general. In the War of Salinas, which happened in 1538, Almagro was defeated and eventually executed by orders of Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's brother. In turn, the Almagristas, led by Juan de Rada, attacked Francisco Pizarro and assassinated him in 1541. In particular, Fernández de Oviedo sought to explain the circumstances that led Juan de Rada to avenge the death of Diego de Almagro. The lapse of 3 years between Almagro's and Francisco Pizarro's respective deaths was a vivid testimony to the inefficiency of colonial rule at the time. The inadequacy of the administration of justice was evident to contemporaries such as Fernando de Oviedo, leading him to speculate and offer an explanation for the power vacuum and resulting factionalism. He sustained that no one but the king himself had the legitimacy to address injustice committed against Almagro, and I quote, "The offense made against Almagro could not be punished by any particular person, but only by the king or his special envoy," end of quote. However, Rada and the Almagristas, or as Oviedo calls them, los de Chile, those from Chile, waited the remedy of justice for 3 years until they act in disregard of the king's prerogatives. Why was the administration of justice delayed? Why did Charles V neglect his royal obligations, permitting newly conquered Peru to descend to civil strife and chaos? Certainly, it was not the fault of the Consejo de Indias, comprised, in Fernando de Oviedo's opinion, of a great number and quality of learned and experienced fathers of good judgment, and by fathers he meant priests. Instead, he concluded that the answer to this question has to be found in the Luther affair. According to Fernández de Oviedo, the Consejo de Indias was not able to address with promptitude the civil strife in Peru because, and I quote, "of the absence of the emperor, our Lord, who was in Germany defending the faith and Christian religion," end of quote. The affair of the heretical Luther and his minions was, in Fernández de Oviedo's view, the greatest of all obstacles to the administration of justice in Peru. Fernández de Oviedo found in the Luther affair a convenient answer to one of the earliest manifestations of the long-term and recurrent failure of European imperialist projects. Europeans could not deliver the kind of civilizing promise that served as an ideological underpinning for their expansionist designs. Bartolomé de las Casas was another Spanish figure that responded to the civilizational breakdown experienced amidst the establishment of colonial rule in the Americas. In 1545, as the newly consecrated Bishop of Chiapas, that is Las Casas, he decried the lack of stable and reliable institutions of public administration. He drafted the Representación a la Audiencia de los Confines, or a letter to the Audiencia de los Confines of 19 October 1545, in concert with Francisco Marroquín and Fray Antonio de Valdivieso, respectively bishops of Guatemala and Nicaragua. They claimed the ecclesiastical right of bishops to adjudicate civil cases in those situations affecting the poor. Furthermore, they argue that the poor, oppressed, and injured were under the protection and shelter of the church. The picture that they depicted was one of unruliness and uncertainty. Magistrates were inefficient as well as complicit in the wrongs made against the local population, both indigenous people and poorer Spaniards. While Marroquin quickly abandoned his counterparts, Las Casas remained steadfast in his advocacy. Eventually, however, he concluded that he could only be effective back in Spain. In a letter he penned in 1535, Las Casas also criticized the destructive consequences of the short-lived German colonial venture in Venezuela. He lamented Charles V's decision in 1528 to grant rights to the Welser banking family to colonize the territory east of Cape La Vela and west of Cape Maracapana. Charles V was heavily in debt to the Welsers, and he used Venezuela as a bargaining chip to level off his financial commitments. Welser control over Venezuela eventually came to an end in 1556. Nevertheless, treatment of the local population at the hands of German colonists set off a wave of refugees, most of whom resettled in modern-day Curaçao. Las Casas attributed the ill fate of the indigenous people who were arbitrarily placed under German rule to a variety of reasons. Among these was Charles V's bad judgment, as well as the Luther affair. He railed against the crimes and havoc that the German explorers made in the region. He observed that the king had been ill-advised to give these lands as collateral for the extensive financing he received from the Welsers. Las Casas concluded that with this deal and transaction, Charles V had condemned the peaceful inhabitants of the region to a terrible fate and destruction. Instead of sending preachers, the emperor sent, and I quote, hungry wolves to take care of the sheep, end of quote. To top it all, he added, the Germans who came to colonize those regions were all, quote unquote, heretics born to that fierce beast of Luther, end of quote. The Luther affair, however, also contributed a foil against which the conquest could be interpreted. Indeed, post-Tridentine commentators view the extra-European spread of Catholicism as a providentially guided development. Thus, seeing the conquest was the way through which divine providence compensated the church with the lands and people of the New World after parts of Europe were lost to Protestantism. In fact, this was a myth characteristic of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. In his Segunda parte de la historia del cisma de Inglaterra, or second part of the English schism, published in 1593, the Jesuit Pedro de Rivadeneira cited the spread of Catholicism to Japan as God's way of compensating for the loss of England. The myth proved to be of long-lasting influence as it shaped Catholic self-understanding throughout Latin America. Fray Jerónimo de Mendieta articulated a similar view, almost concurrently with Rivadeneira. A Franciscan since 1540, he arrived in Veracruz in 1544. He spent time in Tlaxcala, where he made the acquaintance of Toribio de Motolinia, one of the first Franciscan missionaries in Mexico. He learned Nahua and in 1556 began work with Nahua Indians in the region of Toluca. In 1571, during a visit to Spain, he was commissioned to write a history of the Franciscan Provincia del Santo Evangelio of New Spain, or Province of the Holy Gospel of New Spain. The result was the Historia Ecclesiastica Indiana, or Indian Ecclesiastical History, a work that has received attention for its millennial reading of the Christianization of Mexico. Phelan argued that Mendieta articulated a mystical interpretation of the conquest. The work remained unpublished until 1870, but Mendieta had completed it by the time of his death in 1604. Like Fernández de Oviedo and Las Casas before him, Mendieta did not reflect profusely on Luther or on any major developments associated with the spread of Protestantism in Europe. He echoed their opinion and noted that in the 1520s, Charles V did not provide the necessary resources for the Christianization of Mexico. He attributed this neglect in part to Luther and in part to the revolt of the Comuneros of Castile. So the Comuneros was a kind of peasants movement combined with, it was both peasants and urban dwellers who they rise against the power of Charles V in Spain that happened in the 1520s. Moreover, he wrote the Historia with an eye on the new confessional symbol of the Roman Catholic Church. His references to the Council of Trent invested the work with an implicit imprimatur, even if its millennial content resulted in official censure and eventual relegation to obscurity. Yet he found a special place for Luther in his narrative. He contrasted the figure of the German heresiarch to that of the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés. Mendieta posited that Cortés had been carefully chosen and that God used him as an instrument. Furthermore, through him, God opened the door and made way for the preachers of the gospel in the New World. According to Mendieta, the conquest restored and compensated the Catholic Church. The conquest led to, in his words, I quote, the conversion of many souls for the lost and great ruin that the accursed Luther caused. End of quote. Mendieta saw portentous parallels between Luther and Cortés. He believed they were born the same year, but with different fates. Luther was born to disturb the word and to mislead many Catholics away from the faith. Cortés, on the other hand, was born to bring countless people to the faith and deliver them from idolatry. Moreover, according to Mendieta, both began their corresponding life missions in the same year. Thus, for Mendieta, the Luther affair began with Luther's 18-day debate with John Eck, which took place during July 1519. On the other side of the Atlantic, Cortés started his march to conquer Tenochtitlan the same year. In this way, what was lost in Europe was restored in the Americas. It's a kind of divine economy. Mendieta's correlation of Luther and Cortés placed the conquest in a larger frame of reference. It sought to explain the Christianization of the New World in terms that made sense from the perspective of counter-Reformation in Europe. The notion proved to be appealing, and it continued to reemerge in later centuries. Thus, according to José Patricio Fernández de Uride, who lived in the 18th century, it was the matronage of the Virgen de Guadalupe that prevented the spread of the heresies of Luther and Calvin throughout the Spanish colonies. In 1778, Fernández de Uribe, a prebendary in the Cathedral of Mexico, wrote a historical critical treatise on the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe. In Disertación Histórico-Crítica, he sustained that the Roman Catholic Church stood in the obligation of wielding the sword of tradition against the followers of Luther and Calvin. He argued that just at the time when the heresies of Luther and Calvin were spreading as an infectious disease throughout Europe, Spain was extirpating idolatry in the new lands under its sovereign rule and tutelage. Moreover, no heresy took root nor flourished in New Spain in the 258 years since Hernán Cortés' march on Tenochtitlan. The good fortune of the Spanish colonies was in part the result of the arduous labors of the Spanish crown and the always vigilant intervention of the Holy Inquisition. However, the fact that the insidious heresies of Luther and Calvin did not contaminate New Spain was a miracle in itself that could be attributed to the intervention of the Virgen de Guadalupe. The myth of the Counter-Reformation character of Latin American Catholicism endured beyond the 18th century and was by no means circumscribed to New Spain. In fact, the myth became more widely disseminated in the 19th century after the advent of the new American republics. Luther and the Luther affair, not the growth and spread of Protestant missionary activity at the time, continued to provide the backdrop against which the purity of Latin American Catholicism could be assessed. Certainly in this new context, the myth offered conservative sectors of Latin American society with a line of defense against the protruding influences of the Enlightenment and the secularist tendencies of political liberalism. After all, it was no other than Simón Bolívar himself who in 1826 instructed the Bolivian Constitutional Convention about the ideal place of religion in the new political system. And I quote from Bolívar, "Sacred precepts and dogmas are useful, enlightening, and metaphysically evident. We should all profess them. But this duty is moral and not political." In this way, Bolívar was setting his own doctrine of the separation of church and state. In the end, it was the combined influence of these intellectual currents that made Luther, or the image of Luther, genuinely attractive for the first time in Latin America. In Peru, José María de Córdoba y Urrutia incorporated the myth to an intriguing account of the history of Peru. In his Las Tres Épocas del Perú, or Three Epochs of Peru, published in 1844, Córdoba y Urrutia essay a dynastic history from Manco Cápac, circa 1200, to President Ramón Castilla, first president of Peru. Córdoba y Urrutia was part of the civil service at the time he published Las Tres Épocas and was promoted under Castilla in 1846. He was most likely aligned with Castilla's ideological tendencies, and it was the latter who led the conservadores in the Peruvian Congress to adopt the Constitution of 1860. According to the new Constitution, the nation professes the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion. The state protects it and does not allow the public exercise of any other. That's a quote from that Constitution. Córdoba y Urrutia appropriated the Counter-Reformation myth in a clever way. As the title of his work suggests, he organized the narrative into three epochs, or dynasties. The structure corresponded with the political history of Peru. In fact, Turner described him as the inventor of Peru's post-independence master narrative structure. The first part of the work corresponded with the foundation of the empire of the Incas. He designated the second epoch as the Dinastía Ultramarina, or Seaborn Dynasty. Lastly, the third epoch was that of independent Peru. I will say more about this, but I always find this very intriguing because he's writing in this context of the new Peruvian Republic, and he's trying to make sense of the history of Peru. So how do you do this? How do you keep some sense of continuity with the colonial past, with Criollo identity, with the religion, with Catholicism, and at the same time affirm the new nation? How do you do that? So he recurred to this scheme of three stages of Peruvian history. He used the myth to explain the transition between the Inca Empire and the Seaborn Dynasty, which Charles V headed from Europe. The Luther affair was once more seen as part of an intricate network of the developments that left its imprint in Latin American history. While the discovery was one of the most transcendental events in history, it was lamentable that the conquest hindered the implementation of a policy that could elevate inhabitants to the highest level of civilization that they were capable of, according to Urrutia. The work of centuries was destroyed by unquenched greed. In the middle of such traumatic events, a handful of ministers took advantage of the, I quote, docile nature of the Peruvians, end of quote, and introduced their holy religion. In this way, they recovered what was lost in Europe. In an interesting turn, while Rivadeneira in 1593 saw divine providence using Japan to restore the balance in Europe, he saw divine providence using Peru to the same end. Specifically, Córdoba y Urrutia saw in the Christianization of Peru a kind of restoration of what was lost in England. After all, the followers of Luther and Calvin were responsible for the apostasy of Henry VIII, as well as for the defection of England from the Catholic world. Francisco Bauzá was the author of another national narrative. This one described the colonial history of Uruguay. He was one of the most significant historians of Uruguay of the 19th century. As a politician, he firmly believed and defended the notion that religious, that is, Roman Catholic education be offered in public schools. So at that point, there is a public school system in Uruguay. The question was, are we going to teach religion in the public schools? So the position of Bauzá was, of course, we're going to teach religion, and not only any religion, we're going to teach Roman Catholicism because that's our national heritage. He introduced legislation in 1879 to amend the statute that governed Uruguayan public education since 1877. His measure will introduce religious education in the country's public schools, and it did not pass. That year, he published the essay, De la Educación Común, or About Common Education, defining religious education in public schools, and in 1884, he co-founded the Instituto Pedagógico, a private school that embodied his ideas about the role of religious education. Bauzá published his Historia de la Dominación Española en el Uruguay, or History of Spanish Dominion or Domination in Uruguay, in 1880, shortly after beginning his public crusade for religious education. He offered an account of Uruguay's colonial history, describing the emergence of a proto-national identity in the country. He also made use of the Counter-Reformation myth of Latin American Catholicism to explain the discovery and conquest of the New World. He framed the myth in relation to two men, King Ferdinand of Aragon and Pope Leo X. Ferdinand of Aragon, he declared, witnessed the decline of his powerful empire due to the enthronement of a weak family. And Leo X was about to face the spectacle of Luther's schism, the first indication of the rapid political destruction of Rome. That's a quote from Bauzá. Yet both men received great consolation, for just as the Spanish monarch saw his European possessions under threat, he also witnessed how immense territories, I quote, containing the germ of powerful nations, received the heritage of the language and customs of Spain, end of quote. Similarly, just as the temporal power of the Roman pontiff was shaken, new conquered people in America, Asia, and Africa were receiving the instruction of the gospel, and the sectarians of his faith grew by millions. Certainly, he took distance from the conquest, calling it a calamity, and referring to his coreligionists as sectarians. Nevertheless, he also understood the Luther affair to have a resonance of global proportions that forever affected the fate of the Americas. The myth also surfaced in Ecuador. The Franciscan Jose Maria Aguirre used it in 1892 to explain the theological importance of the discovery. Born in Ecuador, Aguirre was a well-known preacher in his country. His eloquence earned him the distinction of preaching during the official government-sponsored religious service commemorating the 4th centenary of the discovery of America. The event was held at the Cathedral of Quito on October 12, 1892. The Ecuadorian poet and journalist Antonio Alomía Llori wrote an account of the celebration and published it along with Aguirre's sermon. Aguirre's sermon was imbued with pride on the role that his religious order played in the Christianization of the New World. Among the Franciscan luminaries that he noted were Christopher Columbus, a Franciscan tertiary, Francisco Solano, missionary to Peru, and Felipe de Jesus, who was martyred in Nagasaki in 1597. The Franciscans endeavored to accomplish not merely the Christianization or evangelization of the New World. Instead, they worked in the civilizing of America. He opened his sermon by affirming that the right philosophy of history allows for supernatural intervention in the great affairs of humanity. Accordingly, without doubt, the discovery of America was predisposed by God for the fulfillment of great ends. Aguirre contrasted the figure of Columbus and Luther. Columbus made his mark precisely when the great union of Europe, formed and sustained by the Catholic faith, was about to come to an end. Martin Luther, on the other hand, was the apostle of Lucifer, who caused havoc on earth, just like the fallen angel did in heaven. Luther pushed nations into the abysm of heresy, according to Aguirre. These were nations that shine as luminaries for their Catholicism in the past. In this context, the Catholic Church needed new nations in order to replace these fallen angels. He compared the Christian faith with a white dove and suggested that at the time of the discovery, it was about to abandon its ancient abode in Europe in search of a new home. And I quote, which will be blessed, which will be the blessed region. I'm sorry, let me paraphrase this, because this was a sermon and there is a rhetorical tone to it. Which will be the blessed region that will receive in its bosom this dove that is flying over the waters and sunset that brings with it the olive branch of peace that flourish in those old fields, he asked. So at this point in the sermon, he's imagining the gospel as a kind of white dove, and this white dove is leaving Europe. And as he's contemplating the white dove that is leaving Europe because of the calamity of the Protestant Reformation, he's wondering, where is this going to land? And he says, well, in America, in the Americas, which is the blessed land, and where the gospel is going to grow by leaps and bounds. In this context, the Catholic Church needed new nations. I'm sorry, I already read that. What was the vehicle that God chose to help to accomplish this transmigration? That vehicle was Cristoforo Colombo, whose name, according to Aguirre, meant dove that carries Christ, working on the name Cristoforo. Martin Luther as the evangelist, educator, and religious caudillo. In the 19th century, the Counter-Reformation myth of Latin America Catholicism ran parallel to a series of new readings of Martin Luther. A common thread was the view of Martin Luther as the harbinger of modernity. His reform movement was broadly seen as a revolt against the Roman Catholic hierarchy. It was this attitude and not the complex theological questions of Luther's day that captured the imagination of a plethora of thinkers. These new readers, in spite of many regional and national differences, share a common outlook shaped by the growing influence of positivism, notions of social progress, and a general anti-clerical posture. At least two elements contributed to a new reception of Martin Luther in parts of Latin America. One of them was the growth of British commercial interest in the region and German immigration to countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. A concomitant development was the increasing activity of Protestant missionaries throughout the region. These two elements often work in tandem in the introduction of a different perspective on Luther, one that can be characterized as Luther the Evangelist. Protestant printing houses and publications were a good example of these two elements working together. Indeed, several intellectual leaders who shaped the young Latin American republics saw Luther and the German Reformation as a milepost that signaled a climatic point in the history of human progress. Such was the perspective on Luther of Domingo Sarmiento from Argentina. An educator who began his career teaching in rural schools, Sarmiento left Argentina in 1841 and moved to Chile in order to avoid the military dictatorship of Juan Manuel de Rosas. In 1842, he established the Escuela Normal de Preceptores in Santiago for the training of teachers. He traveled throughout Europe and the United States, becoming an adept admirer of the educational system of the latter country. He, in fact, wrote a short biography of the North American educator Horace Mann, and he held fast to the historical views of Thomas Carlyle. Sarmiento was elected president of Argentina in 1868 and ruled the country until 1874. He was a prolific writer with numerous books and articles, but his best-known work was Facundo, widely acclaimed as the Argentinian epic of the 19th century. In his Discurso en honor a Darwin, or Discourse in honor to Darwin, Sarmiento expressed his personal adherence to the theory or doctrine of evolution. He described evolution as a general progress observable throughout the cosmos from the stars in the galaxies to the simplest geological formations. Sarmiento applied the concept of evolution to the development of Western culture and used racist categories to explain social progress. And Sarmiento is a figure that you have to handle with care because of his racist views. So in fact, in the 19th century, he could be considered liberal. He believed in education. He was a positivistic. He embraced evolutionary theory. But applying evolutionary thought to social thought, he came up to, or came down with racist conclusions. So he's also responsible, which I don't mention here, with the decimation of the black population in Argentina. So this is a very interesting episode in the 19th century in Argentinian history. He described, he posited the superiority of Greco-Roman civilization, arts, and laws. While Western nations were also called Christian countries, they actually inherited their civilization from the Greeks and Romans. The northern barbarians introduced their institutions, especially the representative system. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity became the bond of union among the semi-learned men. However, the religious ideas of the Hebrew people, and there is an interesting and very clear anti-Semitic perspective here on Sarmiento. However, the religious ideas of the Hebrew people infiltrated, I quote, Christian notions of government. In consequence, principles and institutions such as the freedom of thought and the arts of the Greeks, the Senate, the municipality and law of the Romans, and the right of representation of the Anglo-Saxons were undermined by Christianity's Semitic influence. It was from this social evolutionary perspective that he understood the historical place of Luther and the Luther affair. According to Sarmiento, by the time of Alexander VI, the moral spirit of Christianity was no longer giving direction to society. Indeed, that moral spirit was falling apart as king, princes, and popes gave themselves to the most scandalous disorders. He voiced the anti-Roman Catholic sentiments that characterized the liberalism of the period. Accordingly, he portrayed Luther as shocked by the horrors of the prostitute, as he sustained that the Rome of the Borgias was known at the time. So this is also a strong anti-Roman, anti-clerical sentiment on the part of Sarmientos. He opened up for examination the beliefs which made that Rome possible, concluding that without Alexander, there will be no Luther. In his view, the Reformation only demanded more Christianity, more morality, more purity, less mysteries, less authority, and less ecclesiastical hierarchy. That's a quote. The Protestant spirit of inquiry gave birth to historical criticism in the church, while the printing press advanced the secularization of life. If Sarmiento could understand Luther in light of the excesses of the Borgias, it is also true that he could only understand Ignatius of Loyola in light of Luther. Ignatius was the head of a militia who organized an army of wise and astute politicians whose only aim was to bring to a halt humanity's progress. In this way, Sarmiento summarized the cultural struggle of his day as a contest between the forces of progress, represented by Luther's revolt against the Roman hierarchy and the forces of tradition, as embodied in the figure of Ignatius of Loyola. And I'm coming to the close of the presentation, a short section on Eugenio Maria de Hostos. Interestingly, as the case of Sarmiento indicates, liberals throughout Latin America understood Luther and Protestantism as a source of inspiration for educational reform. Like Sarmiento, the Puerto Rican philosopher Eugenio Maria de Hostos saw in public education the vehicle to advance his progressive aspirations for the region. Educated in Spain, Hostos was an ardent advocate for the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico. In 1871, he traveled to Chile in order to promote the patriotic cause of the two remaining Spanish possessions in the Western Hemisphere. He rapidly became active among the elite intellectual circles of Santiago. Here, he published some of his most important works, such as a new edition of La Peregrinación de Balloán and his lectures on the scientific education of women. In 1873, he visited Brazil and then settled in the Dominican Republic. It was there that he composed his most mature work, Lecciones de Derecho Constitucional and Moral Social. In 1889, he returned to Chile at the behest of President José Manuel Balmaceda. He played a significant role in Chilean public education. Hostos had by then shifted his attention to pedagogy and was interested in educational reform. Consequently, he produced several new works that incorporated his positivistic views and Americanista ideals to the teaching of several subjects. Among these works were the Programa de Geografía, or Program of Geography and History, and Programa de Castellano, or a grammar of Spanish. After spending time in the United States, he returned to the Dominican Republic in 1900 and continued to shape the educational system there until his death. Hostos believed that Protestants had a better grasp of the contribution of knowledge to the progress and betterment of humankind than Roman Catholics. Luther and other European Protestants could be credited with laying the foundation of public schools because they made mandatory the state-sponsored primary education of children. They understood that the creation of schools and the organization of teaching were functions of the state, and consequently, German, Swiss, and Scandinavian Protestants made a great service to civilization. They made of the public elementary schools one of the indispensable organs of culture and for the civilizing of humankind, as Hostos sustained. In this sense, he concluded, Luther was not simply a religious reformer, but a true agent of civilization. In balance, however, Hostos understood Luther primarily as a religious reformer. Consequently, Luther's ideas, in Hostos' estimation, were not comprehensive enough and were insufficient to provide an account of human history and human progress. Furthermore, after the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico became a territorial possession of the United States. Very soon, it became clear that the United States was not interested in relinquishing control over the island. Hostos himself was involved in diplomatic conversations with President William McKinley in January 1899. The new political reality of the island certainly made Hostos more critical of Protestantism and consequently of the figure of Martin Luther. He made the point in a remarkably creative way in his short dialogue, Barrenderos e Iluminadores, a very short essay about people who clean and thinkers. In the short piece, Hostos situated Goethe in a conversation with an unnamed character as they commented on the French Revolution. The topic of the exchange was the difference between political and intellectual revolutions, or the revolutions of brutes, as Hostos called them, and those of luminaries. Goethe argued that political revolutions were merely mechanisms for the disposal of piled-up social malaise. Political revolutions wouldn't be necessary if intellectual revolutions were allowed to unfold to their logical conclusions. Following the scheme, he placed Luther along Oliver Cromwell and Maximilian Robespierre. Luther was the leader of a political and not an intellectual revolution. That is, he was the head of a revolution of brutes and not of luminaries. Goethe, furthermore, and this is still in the essay written by Ostos, set the figure of Luther against those of Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, whom he regarded as the forerunner of the intellectual revolutions that charted the progress of Western civilization. The dialogue is quite revealing since Hostos placed Luther at the center. The piece was as much about the character of revolutions as it was about the historical meaning of Martin Luther. In fact, Hostos' views of Luther as a revolutionary was quite common. For instance, Mariano Pillesa, in the introduction to his Historia Argentina, which was published in 1988, described Luther as a revolutionary caudillo. Luther's historical importance was that, I quote, he appeared as the caudillo of new ideas, and that these new ideas were the revolution against the Catholic theocracy, end of quote. By 1901, however, Ostos did no longer share this mythical political reading of Luther. He no longer saw Luther and Protestantism as the way forward and away from what he deemed as the obscurantism of the Roman Catholic tradition. Instead, he now associated Luther with the Protestantism that shaped the early history of the United States. And by extension, he also regarded the American Revolutionary War as a revolution of brutes. Thank you.
Professor Roldan has agreed to take questions, and I'm just moderating. So, questions for him? Sean.
So, in the 19th century part, the situation, if you will, Catholics or conservatives still take the view that Luther somehow stymied Catholicism and spread it, and the New World was a response, building for all the losses of human right? Right. And the liberals then take this other view that Luther's a good guy, right, fellow, that he comes along with the story. How much of the liberal view just actually reflects what's going on in the United States? In other words, how much is that kind of an England and elsewhere in Europe? How much is that original, might you say, to Latin America, or how much is that just taking in these concepts that are current in wider historiography of Luther in 19th century Europe and elsewhere?
So very good. So there is a section of the essay that I left out for the time. And in that section, I discuss missionary interpretations of Martin Luther, especially in Uruguay. Now, going to your point, this is a question that keeps coming up in many discussions about Protestantism in Latin America. How much of Protestantism in Latin America has originality, or how much of it is just an importation from the United States or Europe? And what is interesting is that at this point, certainly, you have, for instance, a printing press in Uruguay that is publishing tracts that are translations into Spanish of works that were originally published in England or in New York. So they are importing that material and translating it and making it available in Spanish. And the missionaries themselves engage in kind of public debates in the newspapers, presenting the positions of Protestantism. So that reflects that concern that this may be material that is imported. However, when you find, for instance, the figure of Ostos, who was not a missionary, not a theologian, certainly he is engaging what is happening in the United States. But this is the thing. This is where I'm going. In relation to American Protestantism, thinkers like Ostos, and I have another fellow in the essay, Piñero, who was in Cuba, they are not reading. When they are articulating this liberal position, they are not doing it from sources coming from the United States. Instead, they're using French sources. The French context is more important to in shaping the mentality of these liberal thinkers. That's what, you don't have that kind of not yet in the 19th century. And if it comes down to English, it is more British influence in South America than American influence at the time. But for the more secular, let's call them secular thinkers, what they're reading is French literature, and that's where they are drawing their impulses from. Okay?
How much freedom did Protestant missionaries have to operate in Latin America?
Very good. So that's a great question. And so I would say that will depend in a country. For instance, the group that I study for this project in Uruguay, they had a printing press. They participated in the newspaper. One of them, who was a missionary who came from Indiana to Argentina, and he spent last name Wood, W-O-O-D. He also spent time in Peru and opened schools in Peru. He engaged publicly in debate with Roman Catholic bishops and members of the Roman Catholic hierarchy. So I think that would be a considerable freedom. Another example of this is in Buenos Aires, where around this time you have different Protestant groups who are really people migrating from Europe, especially Germany, to Argentina. And one of the most important institutions of theological formation in Latin America, which was the ICEDET, recently was closed like 2 or 3 years ago, was founded by the same missionaries who were active in Uruguay. And that institution had over 100 years, or around 100 years of operation, and it flourished in the 1920s and 1930s. So depending on the place, there was considerable freedom.
Yes. So what was the, are you familiar with the curricula in, for example, Argentina, when education was so important to this president? And if so, what role did, was there a role of theology? Or was that part of the public education system, was actually with education and theology? Because if he's drawing off the Jesuits, then of course, the Jesuits straight.
Okay, so what I have seen in that regard is again related to the case of Uruguay. I found very interesting that there are publications and journals published in Uruguay dedicated to pedagogy, to articles related to pedagogical theory, pedagogical practice, education. And one of the things that they are doing is that they are, in that regard, and this is probably around 1880 and 1890, in that regard, not in theology, but in this point, what they're doing is that they are importing a lot of material from the United States and from England and Prussia at the time. So they are translating and this material, making it available in Spanish. So in that sense, because they are establishing a system of public education, and they are forming teachers through this model of the Escuela Normal or normal school, which Hostos worked with in Chile and Dominican Republic. They are trying to import, and they are drawing a lot from New England and Prussia, for instance. So in terms of the details of the curricula and the syllabi, that's an intriguing question, yes.
I mean, one of the concerns was that the Catholic education of the Jesuits and others is what held Latin America back. So many of the liberals in the 19th century, part of their argument is that we need to get rid of Catholic education, because that's what's holding us back. That's part of that negative Roman legacy, and that's why they turned to the other.
Right, so as you have this split in many places throughout South America between liberals and conservatives, the position of the liberals will be, we have to get rid of Catholic education, and who become like the fall guys for this are the Jesuits. Just think about this. The University of San Marcos, which is still operating, is the oldest university in the Western Hemisphere, founded by Jesuits in the 16th century. Jose de Acosta, the famous missionary, was part of that period of formation of the University of San Marcos.
Let us thank